are over 450 hospital members testifying respectfully against Senate Bill 51. We appreciate Senator Hughes' staff being willing to meet with us yesterday and hear our concerns. Our concerns relate to how the bill would prohibit hospitals from mandating COVID-19 vaccinations for their employees. Section 2 contains an outright prohibition of the vaccine mandates for political subdivisions, and while that doesn't specifically refer to hospitals, political subdivisions do include all types of political hospitals except for the few that are owned and operated by the state. This creates a two-tiered structure and potentially two tiers of care where private hospitals can ensure a vaccinated workforce, but public hospitals can't, potentially leading to a negative consequence for the vulnerable populations that public hospitals typically serve. Section 7 of the bill applies to employers generally, as we've heard, and requires employers to grant exemptions from a COVID-19 vaccine mandate for reasons of conscience. And while conscience is not defined, we believe it will be read very broadly by the courts and create a loophole to the hospital's COVID-19 vaccine requirements that effectively renders any such requirement meaningless and unenforceable, thwarting the efforts of the hospitals that have determined that a vaccinated workforce is the best infection control approach in its facility. Finally, Section 8 of the bill amends Chapter 224 of the Health and Safety Code. This is the chapter that governs policies hospitals have that address the prevention of all vaccine preventable diseases in their facilities, including staff vaccinations. Currently, it makes exemptions for reasons of conscience permissive, but Senate Bill 51 would make that exemption mandatory, and we strongly oppose that change. We heard yesterday from Dr. Zerwas that Chapter 224 is working. He was one of the sponsors of the bill. Senator Nelson was the author of that bill in 2011. It's a very good law. It's working very well, and we urge this committee to not change that law, which, as I say, we believe is working very well and prevents infections in our facility. Thank you.
Well, thanks for your testimony. I realize there are many concerns you have. I will say with regard to that last one in Section 8 of the bill, it is our intent to clean that up and make sure we're not undoing what's been done. This is just going to be about COVID-19 vaccines, so that may help a little bit. But Senators, any questions for Mr. Wohleb? Dr. Schwartner.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one quick question. The vaccine mandate for COVID that is supported by THA versus the vaccine requirement for flu. I understand, or I see around hospitals, individuals that do not have the flu shot. Is there any differential there that you're aware of with THA's position?
Yeah, I don't think we've specifically made that differentiation, if I'm understanding your question. I'm not sure that I do. Is your question, do we view flu vaccines and COVID vaccines differently for hospital employees?
I just, flu is a serious disease as well, and in some ways it's the largest killer of seniors every year. And so as such, you would think that the principle would be that hospitals would also mandate flu vaccine for the protection of their patients and for their coworkers. That's not the case.
I think actually, Senator, perhaps most hospitals do mandate flu vaccines for their employees under that Chapter 224 scheme.
Well, it's interesting because I see a lot of patients that are a lot of actually some coworkers, not a lot, that walk around every flu season with a mask on their face. That's the way it's handled, at least at a hospital I work at. Thank you.
Senator Hall.
Do you have a mandate for employees for all vaccines?
Well, I think those decisions are made hospital by hospital. They are required to have that policy and required to make that assessment, what vaccines are appropriate for vaccine preventable diseases for their staff. And so there may be some variation. I can't tell you that every hospital mandates every vaccine for its employees, but they do make that judgment what's best for their patients and their workforce and incorporate that into their policy.
So you're saying they're selective. They're selective in what vaccines they pick and choose for their employees.
I think based on the evidence that's available to them is what's most appropriate for their patients.
Well, vaccines are important. Why should they have that latitude? Well, that's what we're advocating for, is that flexibility. I think hospitals are able to
make that determination and make that judgment, should be able to make that determination, make that judgment for themselves, and not apply a one-size-fits-all approach. Certainly, the state shouldn't be mandating a one-size-fits-all approach to hospitals. It should leave those decisions to the hospitals, who are in the best position to know what's best for their patients.
Okay.
Senator Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Wohleb, I have a question for you about, do hospital vaccine mandates that lead to staff being fired or dismissed, does that make the current staffing shortage worse than it already is?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think some hospitals are struggling a bit with that. The first thing I would say is most hospitals, at least the information that we have, that have implemented vaccine mandates have had a very high uptake rate, a very high compliance rate with that. So they aren't laying off a lot of employees or having to dismiss a lot of employees. So I think that's a first and important point. Those hospitals, though, that do have that concern, I think they're struggling with that. And some hospitals have made the judgment that they're not going to mandate vaccines, in part, I would imagine, because of that issue. They are concerned about what that would do to their workforce and their ability to deliver care and even keep their doors open, frankly, if enough employees don't take the vaccine. And so it's a problem, it's a dilemma, and it's why I think we need the flexibility for each hospital to judge for itself what's going to be best for its patients and its operations in implementing these policies.
Let's say that we do pass this legislation that prohibits a vaccine mandate, and it is contrary to what happens on the federal level. Does that change what's happening with Medicare participating hospitals in any way?
It's not. I mean, we heard before, we haven't actually seen the language that the Biden administration announced was coming, but this state law would do nothing to the expected mandate that we think is going to come down from the federal government for all Medicare participating hospitals. And so that's really going to put hospitals between a rock and a hard place. Their choice is going to be don't comply with the federal mandate and potentially risk all Medicare funding and get kicked out of the Medicare program, which is a game over and the doors close at that point, or institute the vaccine mandate and potentially be in violation of state law.
How does this legislation potentially create two tiers of hospital care for Texans?
Well, I think particularly in the instance of the public hospitals, as alluded to, public hospitals have this outright prohibition in Senate Bill 51 to mandate vaccinations. Private hospitals can mandate under certain circumstances with some very broad required exceptions. But you could end up in a situation where you have some hospitals, particularly the public hospitals, that don't have vaccine mandates and don't have a vaccinated workforce, a fully vaccinated workforce, and other hospitals that do. And we think that that could set up certainly a two-tiered structure for care.
Okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate your answers.
Thank you, Senator Powell. Senator Hall.
Yeah, just a clarification. I think we're confusing the governor's executive order previously and the bill, because I think the bill covers all hospitals. It doesn't distinguish between state and private. So what you were talking about, I think, was under what the governor had put out, where he addressed the state hospitals, and there did create a two-tier system. But I don't think that is in this bill. Is that correct?
Well,
ultimately, this one covers all private and public.
So we'll have a single tier.
In various sections do kind of have different applicability. In the bill itself, Section 2 only applies to political subdivisions, and Section 7, I think, is the kind of the more broader prohibition that would cover all hospitals.
Well, I think we'd probably look at that, because the intent is to make sure we're protecting the individual's rights in whatever hospital they go to. Right. So say that if we need to fix that, we need to make sure so that it covers all of them.
That's right. Senators, any other questions for the witness? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
The chair calls Gregory Porter.